I'm here to share with you an idea. Why don't we tax robots? Well, this may seem strange to many of you, I guess, but together we are going to see and to try to see why and how we can implement this. Artificial intelligence and robotics in particular is now, as we know, more and more used in all areas of the economy. And jobs are disappearing. For some people, this is good news. Productivity is increasing. New jobs are created. New professions that we don't even know will be created. And on top of that, very boring, repetitive, even dangerous jobs will be replaced by robots. I guess there's not so many people in the room that would like to go now in the sea of Fukushima to check the level of radioactivity on the sea, and is very happy to know that robots are doing that. But there are other people that think a bit different, and they say, this time it's not the same. Why? Because, yes, jobs could be found out, but we see now smart robots, namely robots that have the capacity to think, they have the capacity to decide, they are getting autonomous, they can learn, and they can interact with the people. So these kind of robots eventually may replace most, if not all, jobs. Who is right between these two points of view today, we don't know. But I think we should be clear that there's a serious risk that at least many jobs will disappear, and probably not enough new jobs will be invented to replace the disappearing ones. So if this is true, we need to think right now about the solution to this problem, because it takes always very long to find solution, and if this is true, there are three very negative effects that could occur. First of all, people are losing their jobs, there's no more salary, so the state loses the income tax and the social security tax. Secondly, in addition to that, the state will need more revenue because people unemployed will ask for income from the state. They will need the pension from the social security. And third, the people with no employment have no money, so consumption goes down. They cannot buy enough goods and services, so the economy goes down as well. So in order to solve some of these issues that I've described, among others, there's one solution, and I think it is to tax robots. How do we implement that system? First of all, a robot and a tax on robots should be justified like any other taxes, and it should be justified from an economic and a legal standpoint. From an economic standpoint, you can make the following case. Don't you think that an enterprise that is using a robot instead of a human worker is saving the salary that it should have paid in order to have this job done by a human worker? So there's an economic advantage here that we could tax. From a legal standpoint, this new tax should be justified by the principle of equality of treatment, which requires an objective definition of what is a robot, and also, more difficult, I guess, the principle of ability to pay. In other words, if you levy a tax on anybody, this person should have the financial capacity to pay the tax. So, how do we put in place such a system? What is a robot first? A robot, I think, should be defined in a broad sense of the term, in accordance with the functions that these smart robots are now capable of doing. They are autonomous, they have the capacity to learn, they are evolving, they interact with the people. So under this kind of definition, I think a self-driving car, for example, would be a robot, but not the car itself. But also ROS. You know ROS? ROS is a computer, but it's a computer used by law firm to help the firm to make legal research. And guess what? his specialization is bankruptcy law. Under this definition, I think Ross is a robot because what is important is his function, the capacity to help, to learn, to evolve, and his impact on the labor market. To go a bit further, we could also design and consider having a legal personality to robots. If you think about it, more than 1 century ago, we had the same problem when the legislator decided to grant the legal personality to a corporation. What is a corporation? Have you seen a corporation? Have you spoken with a corporation? No. Because a corporation is a legal fiction that was designed by the legislator in order to grant the personality to this entity called corporation and to give it the possibility to enter into contracts, to be liable for its activities. And then, later on, the corporation became subject to tax. Maybe the time has come for robots also to become a legal person, which would then give them the capacity to enter into contracts and, more importantly, to become liable for their action. But if you go this way, as the Beatles would say, here comes the tax man. We could then consider to implement a tax on robots. How can we do that? I think there are 4 possibilities, basically. The first possibility is to levy the tax at the level of the enterprise. So the enterprise using robots, as I described, could be subject to a tax which should correspond roughly to the saving of salary that it should have spent to hire the robots. A second possibility is to levy an income tax on robots. This is a bit more difficult at this stage because the robots as such, they don't have the financial capacity to pay the tax. But at the second stage, we could very well see that the system could be designed in a way to grant some sort of legal and financial capacity to the robots. A third solution, which is quite interesting in my view, is the value-added tax. The value-added tax is a tax on consumption when you buy goods or for the supply of services. So here we could consider that robots entering into contracts, rendering services, would be subject to the value-added tax, which would raise, by the way, fascinating legal issues. For example, when Ross is giving a legal opinion, is it the same? Is it a legal services as a legal opinion from a lawyer? If a doctor is curing a patient, this is a medical service. But if the robot is curing the patient or helping the doctor, is it the same kind of service? Well, we don't know. We have to think about these issues. And the fourth solution, which is a bit more old-fashioned, I think, is to levy a sort of a fee on the robot. In other words, you would look at the robot like a dog or like a car. This solution is already proposed in a state in America to levy, for example, a tax on drones. But I think it's a bit old perception of robots, which doesn't take into account robots as smart and the capacity to learn. Then, finally, in order to implement that tax, we need a coordination of the system. I mean, this idea is not to raise a new tax and to add a new tax to the system. It's not, oh, we are levying a tax on robots and then we are going to put it on the global system. This tax needs to be coordinated, first of all, domestically, which means we should look at the global local system and make sure that there are not going to be double taxation. For example, if you levy a robot tax on the enterprise, perhaps we should also grant the deduction on the cost of designing the robots, supervising the robots, development of the robot technology. Also, I think this tax should be coordinated at the international level because it needs to be levied on basic principle, which will be recognized worldwide, probably at the level of the United Nations, at the level of the OECD. Otherwise, we could even see the robots going to Monaco, for example. Then what to do with the revenues from the tax? I think the revenues should be used in accordance with the purpose of the levying of the tax. That is to say, we could finance more education to help the people to find jobs which would be more adequate to the evolution of the economy. We could finance the social security, which of course would need extra financing. The day after, I think we can see that these robots are really challenging the tax system as a whole and requires, I think, a global reform of taxation. The revenues, in fact, should be used to help the people to find their way to develop a meaningful life in a world of cohabitation with artificial intelligence and robots. But be careful. Maybe one day the robots will refuse to pay their tax. And even worse, they could force us to pay their taxes.